What does the House of Commons, UK Parliament, do really well, and how could we better communicate that, in your view? It's a tough one.
It's a tough one, partly because I think
it's so big.
Matron, Sir Charles Walker, stop bragging there. Now, this was an administration committee meeting on the 5th of June of this year. Yeah, I know it's a bit far back, but like I say, we're in recess and you guys seem to enjoy this. And the subject of the matter was communication and engagement services provided by the House of Commons administration. And the witnesses were Mark Darcy, Parliamentary Correspondent for the BBC News, basically showing his is bigger. Then there's Lord Norton of Louth, also showing the size of his impressive length, and Professor Meg Russell, Director Constitution Unit for the University College London, showing hers is bigger. Now, even though they all received a rather tough big question that our Sir Charles Walker said, I would say they all came up trumps, especially Professor Meg Russell.
What does the House of Commons, UK Parliament, do really well, and how could we better communicate that, in your view? It's a tough one.
it's a tough one, partly because I think
it's so big.
One tends to think of the things that the House of Commons perhaps doesn't do as well as it might. I think that the House of Commons is very good at some things these days. It's much better now than it used to be at reaching out and picking up subjects that the public are interested in, partly through the petitions mechanism, partly through the backbench business committee mechanism, and having really good debates that kind of prod the government towards doing things. It's less good at actually making the government do things because it is, of course, controlled by a government majority, or under almost all circumstances, and the brief chaotic interludes when that hasn't been the case haven't necessarily been the best advertisement for the Commons there. So I would say it's become a lot better at addressing human issues, the kind of Thursday afternoon backbench debates that you often get about really difficult issues where people talk about relatives of theirs who've taken their own lives, or about their experience of disease or depression or psychological ailments of one sort or another, have been very important in perhaps shifting focuses. But if you're talking about the House of Commons as a genuine check on government, I'm not sure it always looks like a great check on government, to be honest.
I think I'm in total agreement when it comes to the petition committees, also with the backbench committees as well, when it comes to the human issues. And I also agree when he talks about the House of Commons not being a very good check on government as well. But what do you guys think? Leave your comments down below.
Okay, let me just widen that question out slightly as we go down. So Mark said we don't have a great check on government, and yet when I was chair of the procedure committee and I was visited by legislators from parts of the world, developing parliaments, established democracies, they were often impressed about the powers MPs had to hold the executive to account, be it that urgent questions, statements, so on and so forth, private members' bills, to initiate legislation. Lord Norton.
Well, the point I'd make is that there are some structures and procedures that you've got that work well. Mm-hmm. The problem that the Commons faces is that that is not what interests people outside. So in terms of communication, if you're talking about your structures and processes, that doesn't relate to what people are interested in. Because if we look at, if you look at your goals of this particular inquiry, there's a potential incompatibility between raising awareness of Parliament and calling attention to the mechanisms you've got for scrutiny and influence, because that doesn't engage people. So there's a potential incompatibility there. People are much more interested in issues, and they're much more interested in the individuals in the institutions than the institutions themselves. Now, we know from survey evidence that people aren't that distrustful of the constitutional framework we've got. They might not like bits of it, but it's the people who occupy it that they're really distrustful of. So I think that's a problem. So we've got a problem with electors. We've increasingly got a problem with the media in putting material out there, because social media now, the emphasis on immediacy, sound bites, it's squeezing out what the mainstream media can do because they're having to cut back on resources. You're missing out now because the cutbacks on BBC Parliament. There's a problem as well with MPs themselves because they're interested in themselves individually, not necessarily the institution of which they're a member. They'll promote themselves and their party above the interests of the institution. And there's a problem in communicating when there is a problem, because who speaks for Parliament? I mean, a few years back I gave the Michael Ryle Memorial Lecture, and that was the title of the lecture. Who speaks for Parliament? Parliament is two discrete institutions. Each is the sum of its parts. There is no one who can speak for the whole institution. And even within each house, there's a problem how quickly you can respond. Well, if you've got to agree a line to take, by the time you've agreed it, it's too late. So I think there needs to be a fundamental rethink, not so much about the structures and processes, but how you communicate them. How do you get people interested in what you're doing? And the way in is not through actually describing those structures and processes. It's finding another way, say, of emphasising the issues or indeed focusing on individuals. That's what interests people. The media will pick up on when individuals misbehave. What about when individuals achieve some success? What about promoting that? And that's what interests people. There's a human interest element to it. They're not interested in standing orders and how select committees go about their work. So you've got a Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee. That's not necessarily going to engage people, but some of the issues it addresses may do. Mm-hmm. And when you think about the correspondence you quite often get from constituents, it's on issues that come up, say, through private members' bills, because that's what really gets them excited. It's how you exploit that to show that Parliament's addressing issues that interest them, rather than Parliament pushing out information about the structures and the wonderful committees that it's got.
Interesting observations by Lord Norton, especially with engagement to the electorate. Interesting what he had to say about select committee meetings as well. But what do you guys think?
Meg.
That's really interesting, and I agree with all of that, really, and we may agree a dangerous amount on the panel, but I would say some other things. I mean, I think it's there are some obvious answers to your question. What does the House of Commons do well, and how well does the administration do it at publicising it? I mean, it's a pretty uncontroversial thing to say that select committees are, seen as a high point of what the House of Commons does, and I think the administration does a lot of good work at communicating what select committees do. So that's a sort of good on both sides of the ledger. But I think when you get beyond some of those obvious things, going back to what Mark was saying about how impactful Parliament really is on government, my work, which includes quite detailed work on the legislative process, as well as on the House of Lords, which we're primarily not talking about today, but the legislative process in both chambers, suggests that actually Parliament is more influential than it's often given credit for. And I would point to two things which are both quite challenging for communication for the administration, one of which Philip has recently turned his attention to in his writing, which is that a lot of influence goes on behind the scenes. There are lots of places in Parliament where things are transcribed, where things are broadcast, but a lot of the real influence goes on in meetings between members and ministers, persuading people and so on, with the public record not entirely capturing that influence. And then the other thing, which is very subtle, is that some of the things that Parliament does on the public record are not decision-making activities, but they're enormously important for holding the government to account. So things like, if you talk to any member of the public, and if I talk to my students about what they know about what goes on in Parliament, they'll all say Prime Minister's question time, and then they'll all grumble about Prime Minister's question time. They don't know about departmental question times. And in departmental question times, and when ministers are presenting bills, and in backbench debates and opposition days, and in all sorts of stuff that goes on in the chamber and committees, the very fact that the government is being held to account in a public place and having to explain itself is enormously important. And my work talking, and you'll all be familiar with this, you talk to ministers or people who have been ministers, and they talk about the amount of work that they have to put into thinking things through before appearing in front of Parliament. Therefore, Parliament has a deterrent effect. We call this the power of exposure, the power of anticipated reactions. So Parliament, I think, is really important in these ways, but they're not very visible. They're difficult to communicate. And when you set that against the way that, I hate to say it, many MPs talk about Parliament, I mean, government and opposition tend to be united in saying that Parliament doesn't matter. You know, the government wants to pretend that Parliament hasn't won things from it. The opposition wants to pretend or actually genuinely believes that it hasn't won anything from government. So you've got both sides of a natural political divide saying, oh, Parliament doesn't really matter very much. But actually, I would argue that it does. And that actually, as Philip said, you know, who speaks for Parliament? I think maybe beyond the administration, we need to think about how members communicate the importance of what Parliament does collectively, because of course this is by its nature a divided place into, you know, it's not just government opposition, it's obviously different parties. But to what extent do members concentrate on celebrating the achievements of Parliament as a collective institution? I think the speakers of both houses do that quite a lot, but I think members could do it rather more.
Yeah. As I say to my children, this wonderful country didn't happen by accident. It's shaped by the laws that came out of Parliament over centuries.
Don't do it, Sir Charles Walker. Don't beat me. I'm only a mere pleb. Only kidding, Sir Charles Walker. But I did find what Professor Meg Russell had to say was very, very interesting. And she also had a fantastic moment in the other video I uploaded as well, which is out now. And there is the full version of this full select committee meeting also uploaded at the same time. So I hope you do go and watch. Also, if you enjoy this video, please give it a like. And if you enjoy stuff like this in the select committee meetings, I do all this stuff and cover as much as I can. So subscribe. And I will leave the video here and I shall bid you farewell and take care, my friends.